The moment he decided she didn't belong was the moment everything began to fall apart. The night air in downtown Baltimore hung thick at 78 degrees, the glow of streetlights stretching across polished asphalt as a sleek black sedan idled quietly at the curb, its engine humming low like it knew something no one else did. Inside sat Ava Carter, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, her expression unreadable, her breathing steady, as if the chaos about to unfold had already played out in her mind 100 times before. Then came the flash, red and blue slicing through the darkness, reflecting off storefront glass and the curious eyes of strangers who slowed their steps just enough to watch without getting involved. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his cruiser with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned, his boots striking the pavement with sharp, deliberate rhythm as he approached the driver's side, his gaze narrowing the second he saw her. "License and registration," he said, voice flat but edged with something colder, something heavier. Then authority. Ava didn't move right away, not out of hesitation, but precision, her fingers reaching slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact, her silence stretching just long enough to make him uncomfortable without saying a word. Around them, phones began to rise, quiet murmurs weaving through the humid air as the scene built itself without permission. Daniel leaned in slightly, scanning the interior, his eyes quick to judge, quicker to conclude. "Step out of the vehicle," he added. Firmer now, as if the command itself carried weight beyond reason. Ava opened the door and stepped out smoothly, her posture straight, her movements controlled, not rushed, not resistant, just measured. The cuff of her blazer caught a flicker of light, and for the briefest second, something about her didn't match the story forming in his mind, but he ignored it because certainty was easier than doubt. "You match a description," he said, though even he didn't elaborate, his hand hovering near his radio, his stance tightening as the crowd inched closer. Ava's eyes moved, not in fear, not in defiance, but in quiet observation, taking in every angle, every camera, every breath of tension hanging between them. "There's been a mistake," she said softly, her voice calm, grounded, but he didn't hear it, or maybe he chose not to. The moment stretched, suspended in something fragile, something unseen, and then, click, the sound of metal closing around her wrists broke through the night, sharper than the sirens, louder than the whispers. A few people gasped, others leaned in, hungry for something they didn't understand. Ava didn't resist, didn't raise her voice, didn't plead. She simply turned her head slightly, eyes catching the reflection of the cruiser lights in the window beside her. And for the first time, something shifted, not outside, but within the silence itself. "You really think you can just," Daniel started, but his words trailed off, because Ava had already moved past him in a way he couldn't see. She tilted her head just enough, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should check that." "Again," she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a fact waiting to be understood. And somewhere in the distance, too subtle for most to notice, the low rumble of approaching engines began to echo through the street, steady, controlled, and closing in. The sound of those engines grew louder, not aggressive, not chaotic, but controlled, like something that moved with purpose rather than urgency. And Ava Carter felt it before anyone else did, not in her ears but in the shift of the air itself. Officer Daniel Brooks did not notice it yet, his attention still locked on the small details he thought mattered, the angle of her posture, the calm in her voice, the way she was not reacting the way people usually did, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. "Stand still," he said, firmer this time, as if repeating the command would restore the balance he believed he had. But Ava had already stepped beyond that moment, her gaze drifting past him toward the far end of the street where headlights began to appear, low and steady, cutting through the night like a quiet signal. The crowd noticed it next, their murmurs shifting tone, curiosity turning into something closer to confusion as three black SUVs approached in perfect spacing, slowing without sirens, without flashing lights, just presence. Daniel finally turned, his brow tightening, instinct pulling his focus away from Ava for the first time, and in that single second, the dynamic changed, subtle but undeniable. The vehicles came to a smooth stop along the curb, engines still running. Doors closed for a brief pause that felt longer than it was. And then, in quiet synchronization, they opened. No one rushed out. No one shouted. No one explained anything. And somehow that silence carried more weight than any command Daniel had given all night. Ava remained exactly where she was, hands still restrained, posture unchanged. But there was something different now, something that did not belong to the situation Daniel thought he was controlling. He stepped forward slightly, trying to reassert his authority, his voice cutting sharper than before. "Stay back, all of you." Directed at no one in particular, yet meant for everyone. But it did not land the way it usually did. The individuals stepping out of the SUVs did not hesitate, did not argue, did not even acknowledge the command, their movements calm, precise, as if they were following a script written long before this moment existed. One of them, a tall man in a dark suit, adjusted his jacket and walked forward with measured steps, his eyes not on Daniel, but on Ava. The crowd fell quieter, phones still raised, but hands less steady now, the energy shifting from spectacle to uncertainty. Daniel felt it then, a crack in the certainty he had carried into this moment, small but spreading, like something he could not quite define but could no longer ignore. "This is an active investigation," he said, louder now, trying to fill the space with control, but his words sounded thinner than before, less solid. Ava turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes again, and there was no anger there, no fear, only a calm that felt out of place, as if she had already seen the ending. "You should listen," she said quietly, and it was not a plea, not even a suggestion, it was simply truth. The man in the suit stopped a few feet away, his presence steady, his gaze finally shifting to Daniel. And in that exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something Daniel was not part of, something that did not include him at all. The night felt different now, the air heavier, the sound softer, as if the entire street was holding its breath, waiting for something that had already begun to unfold. Daniel Brooks felt the shift before he understood it, like the ground beneath him had tilted just enough to throw off his balance, not physically, but mentally, the kind of imbalance that does not show on the surface but starts to unravel everything underneath. The man in the dark suit stood still for a moment, letting the silence stretch, his presence alone commanding more attention than any badge or raised voice ever could. And when he finally spoke, his tone was calm, measured, and precise. "Officer, I suggest you remove the restraints," he said, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a certainty that did not leave room for interpretation. Daniel blinked, his jaw tightening as he instinctively straightened his posture. "This is a lawful stop," he replied, his voice sharper now, trying to regain control of a situation that was quietly slipping away from him. "She matches a description and I am conducting an investigation." But even as he said it, the words felt thinner, less grounded, like something he had repeated so many times it no longer needed proof. The man did not react to the explanation, did not argue, did not even acknowledge the reasoning. He simply held Daniel's gaze for a brief second before shifting his attention back to Ava. And in that glance, there was recognition, not surprise, not confusion, just confirmation. Ava Carter stood exactly as she had before, her hands still secured, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, but now there was something else in the air around her, something that no longer aligned with the role Daniel had assigned to her just minutes ago. The crowd, once filled with quiet whispers and subtle judgment, had gone almost completely still, the kind of silence that does not come from disinterest, but from realization, phones still raised but no longer searching for drama, now capturing something none of them fully understood. Daniel felt every pair of eyes shift, not toward Ava, but toward him, and for the first time that night, he was no longer the center of control, he was the one being watched, measured, evaluated. "I am going to need you to step back," he said, this time directing his words toward the suited man. But the command lacked weight, lacked authority, and both of them knew it. The man reached slowly into his jacket, not in a way that triggered alarm, but in a way that signaled routine. And when he pulled out a small, dark credential case, he did not flash it quickly or dramatically. He simply opened it and held it at a natural height, letting Daniel take in what he needed to see. The world seemed to narrow in that moment. The lights, the sounds, the presence of the crowd fading into the background as Daniel's focus locked onto the insignia, the seal. The identification that did not belong to his jurisdiction did not belong to his authority, and certainly did not belong to a situation he could control. His breath caught, just slightly, just enough to disrupt the rhythm he had carried all night, and his grip on the situation loosened in a way he could not hide. Ava turned her head once more, meeting his eyes, and for the first time, there was something different in her gaze, not anger, not triumph, but clarity, the kind that comes when the truth no longer needs to be hidden. "You really should have checked," she said quietly, her voice steady, her words landing with a weight far heavier than their volume. And in that moment, as the night seemed to hold its breath again, Daniel realized that this was no longer an investigation he was leading. It was a situation he had already lost control of long before he even understood what it was. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the street like a weight no one had prepared for, and Daniel Brooks felt it pressing against his chest, subtle but undeniable, as his eyes remained fixed on the credential in front of him. The insignia clear, the authority unmistakable, something far beyond the scope of a routine stop or a quick assumption made under flashing lights. His mind searched for something to hold on to, procedure, protocol, anything that could anchor him back into control. But the more he reached, the more it slipped, because this was not a situation he had trained for, not one he could navigate with confidence. The man in the suit closed the credential slowly, deliberately, as if the act itself marked the end of any discussion that might have existed. And then he spoke again, his tone unchanged. "Remove the restraints," he repeated, not louder, not harsher, just final. Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed, not by the agents now positioned behind the man, not by the crowd that had gone completely still, and certainly not by Ava Carter, who stood in the center of it all, calm as ever, her presence no longer blending into the scene but defining it. The red and blue lights continued to flicker across her face, but now they felt out of place, like remnants of a reality that no longer applied. Daniel swallowed, his hand hovering for a brief second before moving toward the cuffs, the metal cool against his fingers as he unlocked them, the sound softer this time, almost swallowed by the silence that surrounded them. Ava lowered her hands slowly, not rubbing her wrists, not reacting in any visible way, just letting them rest at her sides as if the moment had already passed for her. The crowd shifted slightly. A collective breath released, but no one spoke, no one moved closer, because something about the scene had changed in a way that demanded distance, respect, awareness. Daniel took a small step back, his posture no longer rigid, his voice no longer certain. "I did not have all the information," he said, the words feeling incomplete even as they left his mouth, because they were not an explanation, not an excuse, just a recognition of something he could no longer deny. Ava looked at him then, fully this time, her gaze steady, unshaken, and for the first time, he saw her. Not as a figure in a situation, not as a subject of suspicion, but as someone who had been standing in control long before he arrived. "No," she said quietly, her voice carrying through the stillness without effort. "You chose not to look for it." And the difference between those two things settled heavily in the space between them. Behind her, one of the agents stepped forward slightly, speaking into a device clipped near his collar, his words low, controlled, "Sight is secure." And that simple phrase shifted everything again, turning the street from a public scene into something else entirely, something structured, something contained. Daniel's eyes moved from Ava to the agents, then back again, the realization building not in a single moment, but in layers, each one harder to ignore than the last. "What is this?" he asked, quieter now, not demanding, not commanding, but searching, and for the first time, there was no immediate answer, only the steady presence of people who already knew exactly what this was. Ava took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough for her voice to reach him without effort, her tone calm, controlled, undeniable. "This is the part where you start listening," she said, and somewhere in the distance, the low hum of the city continued, unaware that in this single moment, the balance of power had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Daniel Brooks did not respond right away, not because he did not hear her, but because for the first time that night, He was unsure of what response even meant in this moment. His training telling him to regain control, his instincts telling him that control had already shifted beyond his reach. The street no longer felt like his jurisdiction, no longer felt like a place where his badge carried the final word. And that realization settled into his chest heavier than any command he had given. Earlier, Ava Carter stood in front of him, composed, grounded, her presence no longer something he could dismiss or reinterpret, and the agents behind her remained still, not tense, not reactive, simply aware, as if every second unfolding had already been accounted for. One of them stepped slightly closer to Ava, his voice low but clear. "We are ready when you are." And that single sentence reframed everything. Not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as confirmation that she was the one, guiding what happened. Next, Daniel's eyes flickered between them, searching for a point of entry, something to say that could re-establish a sense of authority, but every option felt smaller than the reality in front of him. "If there has been some kind of misunderstanding," he began, his voice slower now, measured in a way it had not been before, but the words did not carry conviction, they carried distance. As if he was already stepping back from the situation he had created, Ava tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet clarity in her gaze that made it impossible to ignore what she was about to say. "This was not a misunderstanding," she replied calmly, each word deliberate. "This was a decision, and the distinction landed with precision, not loud, not dramatic, but final." The crowd shifted again, some lowering their phones, others holding them tighter, as if unsure whether they were witnessing something ordinary or something that should never have happened at all. The flashing lights from Daniel's cruiser continued to cut across the scene, but now they felt out of place, like an echo from an earlier moment that no longer applied. One of the agents moved toward the vehicle Ava had been standing beside, scanning it briefly, not searching in the way Daniel had, but confirming something already known, his movements efficient, controlled, and without hesitation. Daniel noticed it, the difference in approach, the absence of doubt, and it made his own actions from minutes ago feel exposed, incomplete, driven by something he could not easily name. "You stopped me without cause," Ava continued, her voice steady, not raised, not emotional, but grounded in something far more difficult to challenge. "And you made assumptions without verification." And she did not need to say more than that, because the weight of those words filled the space between them. Daniel opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, but no words came, only the awareness that anything he said would not change what had already been set in motion. Behind Ava, the man in the suit stepped forward again, his posture relaxed but precise. "Officer Brooks," he said, addressing him directly for the first time, his tone calm, controlled. "You are no longer required to manage this scene." And there was no hostility in the statement, no accusation, just a quiet removal of responsibility that felt more final than any confrontation. Daniel nodded once, almost instinctively, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the tension that had defined his stance beginning to fade, replaced by something quieter, something closer to realization. Ava took one small step forward, not to close distance, not to assert dominance, but to stand fully in the moment that now belonged to her, her eyes meeting his one last time. "What you saw," she said softly, "was never the full picture." And as the agents began to move with quiet coordination around her, the street itself seemed to shift, no longer a place of accusation, but a space where truth had finally caught up with assumption. The street did not return to normal, it transformed, and Daniel Brooks could feel that transformation settling around him like a quiet judgment, not spoken but undeniable, as the agents moved with calm coordination, their presence no longer something that needed to be explained, only acknowledged. Ava Carter stood at the center of it, not elevated, not dramatic, just present in a way that redefined everything that had happened before, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if this moment was not unexpected but simply inevitable. One of the agents opened the rear door of one of the black SUVs, not rushing, not gesturing, just preparing, while another remained near Ava, his attention scanning the surroundings with quiet precision, ensuring that everything unfolding remained controlled, contained, intentional. Daniel remained where he was, a few feet away, no longer directing, no longer questioning, his hands at his sides, his thoughts moving faster than his voice could follow, replaying the last 10 minutes in fragments that no longer aligned the way they had when he first stepped out of his cruiser. "I followed protocol," he said finally, the words coming out slower than he expected, not as a defense, but as something he was trying to hold on to, something that made sense in a moment that no longer did. Ava turned slightly toward him, not fully, not abruptly, just enough to acknowledge that he had spoken, and there was no tension in her movement, no urgency, only a calm that made his statement feel smaller than it sounded. "Protocol begins with observation," she replied, her voice even, measured, "and it ends with verification." And she let the words settle, not expanding on them, not pushing further, because she did not need to. Daniel looked down for a brief second, the reflection of the cruiser lights catching on the pavement beneath his feet, shifting patterns of red and blue that now felt disconnected from the reality around him, like symbols of authority that had lost their context. The crowd had started to thin, not all at once, but gradually, people stepping back, lowering their phones, their curiosity replaced by something quieter, something closer to understanding that they had witnessed a moment that was not meant for spectacle. One of the agents spoke softly into his communication device again, his voice barely audible, but the effect immediate, subtle adjustments in positioning. A final check of the area, a confirmation that everything was proceeding exactly as intended. Ava took a step toward the SUV, her movement smooth, unhurried, but she paused just before reaching the open door, her attention returning to Daniel one last time, not out of obligation, not out of confrontation, but out of something else, something closer to clarity. "You saw what you expected to see," she said, her tone unchanged, "and you acted on it." And the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any accusation could have. Daniel lifted his eyes to meet hers again, and for a moment, there was nothing else in the space between them, no agents, no vehicles, no crowd, just the quiet recognition of what had happened and what it meant. He nodded once, not fully understanding, but no longer resisting the understanding that was beginning to form. Ava held his gaze for a second longer, then turned and stepped into the vehicle, the door closing softly behind her, not with finality, but with precision. The agents moved almost immediately after, doors closing in sequence, engines steady, the SUVs preparing to leave as seamlessly as they had arrived. Daniel remained on the sidewalk, the flashing lights of his cruiser still painting the street in familiar colors, but the meaning behind them felt different now, less certain, less absolute. And as the vehicles began to pull away, blending back into the flow of the city without urgency or display, Daniel stood there in the quiet that followed, aware that the moment had passed, but also that something far more lasting had just begun. The red and blue lights continued to flash long after the black SUVs disappeared into the night, but now they felt hollow, like echoes of authority without certainty, and Daniel Brooks stood there alone on the sidewalk, the humid air pressing gently against his skin as the city resumed its rhythm around him, cars passing, distant voices returning, as if nothing had happened, yet everything had. He exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his eyes tracing the path where the vehicles had vanished, trying to make sense of a moment that refused to fit into the structure he had relied on for years. His radio crackled softly at his shoulder, a routine check-in, a voice asking for status. But for a second, he did not respond, not because he could not, but because the words did not come as easily as they used to. "Situation resolved," he finally said, his tone measured, controlled, but quieter than before, as if something inside him had shifted just enough to change. The way he spoke, across the street, a few onlookers lingered, their conversations low, their glances brief, no longer focused on him, no longer waiting for action, just processing what they had seen in their own way. Daniel moved back toward his cruiser, each step slower, less certain, his reflection catching briefly in the window as he reached for the door handle, the familiar outline of his uniform looking the same, yet feeling different, like it no longer carried the same unquestioned weight it had before. He paused for a moment, hand resting on the cool metal, his mind replaying Ava Carter's words, not the tone, not the delivery, but the meaning behind them. The quiet certainty that had never needed to rise above a calm voice. You chose not to look for it. The sentence echoed, not as an accusation, but as something more difficult to dismiss, something that did not fade when the moment ended. He opened the door and sat inside. The interior of the cruiser wrapping around him in familiar angles and controls, the dashboard lights steady, the radio humming softly. Everything exactly where it should be, and yet the sense of control he associated with it felt altered, less absolute. He glanced at the rearview mirror, catching his own eyes for a brief second, and there was something there he had not noticed before, not doubt, not fear, but awareness, the kind that does not disappear once it appears. Outside, the streetlights stretched in long lines across the pavement, guiding traffic, illuminating paths, simple, consistent, predictable, everything he had believed his role represented. And yet tonight had shown him something else, something that did not follow those lines, something that required more than routine, more than assumption. He reached for the radio again, hesitated, then adjusted it slightly, not to respond, but to listen. The voices on the other end continuing their normal flow, calls coming in, units responding, the system moving forward as it always did. Daniel leaned back in his seat, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, not gripping, not directing, just present, as the last traces of flashing lights reflected faintly against nearby windows, fading gradually into the steady glow of the city. And in that quiet moment, with the noise of the night returning to its usual rhythm, he understood something he had not before, not fully, not clearly, but enough to change the way he would see the next person he stopped, the next moment he stepped into. Because sometimes the shift does not happen in the chaos. It happens in the silence that follows, when there is nothing left to hold on to except the truth you did not see coming. The engine of the cruiser idled softly beneath Daniel Brooks as the city continued moving around him, unchanged on the surface, but something inside him refused to settle back into the routine he had known for years, the kind of routine that once felt automatic, unquestioned, almost mechanical. He stared through the windshield at the stretch of road ahead, the streetlights casting long reflections across the hood of the car, each one identical to the last, predictable, steady, reliable. And yet tonight those same lights seemed to reveal something different, something he had overlooked not just once, but repeatedly. His fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel, not out of impatience, but thought, a quiet rhythm that matched the slow shift happening in his mind. The radio buzzed again. Another call coming through, another situation needing attention, another moment where he would be expected to step in, assess, decide, act, all within seconds, all based on what he saw in front of him. He reached for it, paused, then finally pressed the button. Unit 12, go ahead, his voice steady, professional, but beneath it there was a layer that had not been there before, something more deliberate, more aware. The dispatcher's voice came through with coordinates and details, a routine report. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent, and yet Daniel did not move right away. Instead, he sat for a second longer, letting the information settle, letting himself process not just what was said, but how he would approach it. Across the intersection, a pedestrian waited at the crosswalk, hands in pockets, head slightly down, just another figure in the flow of the city. Someone he might have barely noticed before. But now his eyes lingered for a moment longer, not with suspicion, not with assumption, but observation. The difference was subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but to him it felt significant, like adjusting a lens that had been slightly out of focus for far too long. He finally shifted the cruiser into drive, pulling away from the curb with smooth control, the tires rolling over the pavement with a quiet hum, blending back into the movement of traffic. But this time, he was not simply reacting. He was thinking. The memory of Ava Carter did not replay in sharp flashes anymore. It settled into something deeper, something quieter, her voice, her calm, the way she had never needed to raise anything but the truth itself, and how that had been enough to change everything. He approached the next intersection, slowing as the light turned red, the glow reflecting across his windshield, and for a brief moment, everything stood still again. Cars lined up, engines idling, people waiting. The entire scene paused in perfect order. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the wheel, his posture relaxed but attentive, his eyes scanning not for threats, but for understanding, for context, for the full picture that he had once believed could be captured in a single glance. The light turned green, and the cars began to move, one after another, each driver following the same signal, the same structure, the same expectation. But Daniel knew now that not everything followed that kind of simplicity. Not everything could be reduced to a quick decision or a surface-level conclusion. As he drove forward, merging into the steady flow of the city, there was no dramatic shift, no sudden realization that changed everything in an instant, just a quiet awareness that stayed with him, guiding his focus, shaping his perspective, reminding him that the next moment, the next encounter, the next person he faced would not be defined by what he expected to see, but by what he was willing to truly understand. And in that subtle change, something far more lasting than control began to take root. The city stretched ahead of Daniel Brooks in long, uninterrupted lines of motion, headlights gliding past like silent signals in the dark, each one carrying someone somewhere, each one part of a system that kept moving whether he understood it or not. And for the first time in a long while, he was not trying to control it. He was observing it. The cruiser moved steadily down the avenue at 30 miles per hour, the hum of the engine blending into the rhythm of the road, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping, not tense, just present. And that difference, small as it seemed, changed the way everything felt. Another call came through the radio, clearer this time, more defined, a report of a suspicious individual near a convenience store just a few blocks ahead. Nothing urgent, nothing escalating, just a situation waiting to be interpreted. Daniel listened carefully, not just to the words, but to the tone, the context, the space between the details, and instead of accelerating immediately, instead of moving with assumption, he slowed slightly, letting the information settle into something more complete. The store came into view on the right side of the street, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly through the glass windows, casting a pale glow onto the sidewalk where a man stood near the entrance, his posture relaxed, his attention focused on something in his hands, maybe a phone, maybe something else, but nothing about him suggested urgency, nothing suggested threat, and yet the report had framed him that way. Daniel pulled the cruiser to the curb, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to observe without interrupting, his eyes scanning the scene with a different kind of focus, one that did not rush to label, one that allowed space for understanding. He watched the man for a few seconds, noting the details that mattered, the steady breathing, the lack of tension, the absence of anything that would justify immediate action, and in that pause, he felt something shift again, not in the situation, but in himself. The memory of earlier that night surfaced, not as a sharp image, but as a quiet reminder. Ava Carter standing still under flashing lights, saying nothing, doing nothing wrong, and yet, everything about the moment had been shaped by what he assumed instead of what he confirmed. He stepped out of the cruiser slowly this time, the door closing with a soft click behind him, his posture open, his movement measured, not imposing, not reactive, just present. The man near the store glanced up briefly, noticing him, but did not step away, did not tense, just acknowledged the presence and returned to what he was doing. Daniel stopped a few feet away, keeping distance, his voice calm. Good evening, he said, not as a command, not as a test, just a greeting, and the difference in tone carried more meaning than the words themselves. The man nodded slightly, responding in kind, and for a moment, nothing escalated, nothing shifted into conflict, just a simple exchange that did not require force, did not require assumption. Daniel asked a few questions, straightforward, respectful, allowing the answers to shape his understanding rather than forcing them into a conclusion he had already decided, and within moments, the situation clarified itself. The report had been incomplete, misinterpreted, something small that had grown larger through distance and lack of context. He nodded. Once, acknowledging the man's explanation, stepping back slightly. "Thank you," he said, and this time, the words carried weight, not authority, but recognition. As he returned to the cruiser, the street felt the same, the lights the same, the sounds unchanged, but the way he moved through it had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, because once you see beyond the surface, once you recognize the difference between assumption and truth, You cannot go back to the moment before you knew it existed. And as Daniel drove away from the store, merging once again into the steady flow of the city, he understood that what had happened earlier that night was not just a mistake, it was a turning point, one that would follow him into every decision that came next. The cruiser moved forward into the night with a steadiness that felt different now, not because the road had changed, but because Daniel Brooks no longer saw it the same way. The lines on the pavement no longer just guiding direction, but reminding him how easily a path could be followed without ever questioning where it led. The city lights stretched endlessly ahead, reflections shifting across his windshield, and for once, he was not rushing to the next call, not chasing urgency, but allowing space between each decision, each observation, each moment that required more than instinct. The radio crackled again, this time sharper, a dispatcher's voice carrying a note of concern. A report from another unit requesting backup near a parking structure just under half a mile away. Not an emergency, but something uncertain, something that could turn either way depending on how it was handled. Daniel acknowledged the call. Calmly, his voice even, Unit 12 responding. And as he turned onto the next street, he felt that quiet awareness return, the same one that had followed him since earlier. Not loud, not overwhelming, just present, guiding his focus in a way that felt intentional. The parking structure came into view, its concrete levels rising in layers, shadows stretching across the entrance where a small group of people stood, their figures partially lit by overhead lamps that flickered softly, casting uneven light across their faces and movements. Another patrol car was already there, parked near the entrance, its lights on but less intense than before. No urgency in the scene, just tension, the kind that could either settle or escalate depending on how it was approached. Daniel slowed as he pulled in, not stopping abruptly, not announcing himself with force, but easing into the space, observing first, letting his eyes adjust to the details, the posture of the individuals, the distance between them, the tone of their voices as they spoke to the other officer. He stepped out of the cruiser and closed the door quietly, his presence known but not imposed, and for a moment he simply watched, allowing the situation to present itself rather than forcing it into a shape he expected. The other officer glanced toward him, a brief nod exchanged, and Daniel approached at a measured pace, not rushing to take control, but to understand what was already unfolding. "What do we have?" he asked calmly, his voice steady, and the response came back just as measured, a misunderstanding between two individuals over a parking space. Words exchanged, tension rising, but nothing beyond that. Nothing that required escalation. Daniel shifted his attention to the people involved, noting their expressions, the frustration, the defensiveness, but also the absence of real threat, the absence of anything that justified force or assumption. He stepped slightly closer, keeping his posture open, his tone even. "Let us take a breath here," he said, not as an order, but as a suggestion that carried weight through calmness rather than authority. The group hesitated for a second, then the energy shifted, just slightly, enough to create space where there had been none before. Daniel listened as each person spoke, not interrupting, not directing, just allowing the situation to unfold in its full context. And as the details became clearer, the tension began to dissolve, replaced by understanding, by the realization that what had seemed larger from a distance was smaller up close. Within minutes, the situation settled. The individuals stepping back, their voices lower now, their posture relaxed, the moment no longer holding the same edge it had when he arrived. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the resolution, and stepped back toward his cruiser, the concrete structure behind him now just another part of the city, no longer a point of concern. As he got back into the driver's seat, he paused for a second, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his mind not replaying the scene, but recognizing the difference in how it had unfolded, how the absence of assumption had allowed something simple to remain simple. And as he pulled away, merging once again into the quiet rhythm of the night, he understood that control did not come from acting first. It came from seeing clearly before deciding to act at all, and that clarity was something he would carry with him long after this shift ended. The night continued to unfold in steady motion as Daniel Brooks guided his cruiser through the quiet streets, the city now settling into that late hour where everything slowed just enough to feel intentional, where the noise softened, and the details became clearer if you were willing to notice them. The dashboard clock read 11:28 p.m., the soft glow casting a faint light across his hands as they rested loosely on the steering wheel. His posture no longer rigid, no longer driven by urgency, but grounded in something more measured. The radio remained active, voices coming and going, reports filed, units responding, the system operating exactly as it always had. But Daniel was not moving through it the same way anymore. He turned onto a narrower street lined with small businesses, most of them closed, their windows dark except for a few dim lights left on inside, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. And as he drove past, his eyes moved with purpose, not scanning for problems, but observing the full picture, the stillness, the subtle movement, the absence of tension. A figure appeared ahead near a bus stop, sitting alone on the bench, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped together. Not unusual, not alarming, just someone waiting, existing in a space that did not demand attention. And yet Daniel slowed slightly as he approached, not out of suspicion, but awareness. He pulled over a few yards away, leaving enough distance to avoid intrusion. The cruiser idling quietly as he watched for a moment, taking in the details without jumping to conclusions, the steady rise and fall of the person's shoulders, the relaxed posture, the lack of urgency. He stepped out of the vehicle slowly, the door closing with a soft click, and approached with a calm presence, not announcing himself with authority, but with intention. "Evening," he said, his voice even, respectful, allowing the space to remain calm. And the person looked up, meeting his gaze with a neutral expression, not startled, not defensive, just aware. "Everything okay tonight?" Daniel asked, not as an interrogation, but as a check-in, and the response came back simple, clear, the person explaining they were waiting for a late bus, nothing more, nothing less. Daniel nodded, acknowledging the answer without pushing further, without searching for something that was not there, and for a moment, the interaction remained exactly what it was, a brief exchange between two people, not a situation to be controlled, not a problem to be solved. He took a small step back, giving space again. "Stay safe out here," he said, the words carrying a different kind of weight now, not a directive, but a genuine statement, and the person nodded in return, a quiet understanding passing between them before Daniel turned and walked back to his cruiser. As he sat down again, the familiar interior no longer felt like a shield or a position of power, but simply a place where decisions were made. And those decisions now carried a different kind of responsibility. He glanced once more at the bus stop through the side mirror, the figure still sitting there, unchanged, unthreatened, just part of the city's quiet rhythm. And as he pulled back onto the road, the realization settled deeper, not as a sudden shift, but as something steady, something that would remain. The night had not demanded anything extraordinary, no dramatic events, no high-stakes situations, but in the absence of chaos, Daniel had found something more difficult to face. The understanding that how he chose to see the world mattered just as much as what he chose to do in it. And as the cruiser moved forward into the calm stretch of the night, that understanding stayed with him, shaping each moment that followed in ways he could no longer ignore. The night was nearing its quietest hour when Daniel Brooks turned onto a long stretch of road that led back toward the precinct, the city lights thinning out as the buildings grew shorter and the traffic became lighter, each passing car more distant than the last. And for the first time since his shift began, there was nothing immediate pulling at his attention, no call waiting, no voice in his ear, just the steady hum of the engine and the soft glow of the dashboard. He slowed as he approached an intersection, the red light casting a warm reflection across the windshield, and he let the cruiser idle there, his hands resting calmly on the wheel, his posture relaxed but present, aware of the stillness around him. The events of the night no longer replayed in sharp fragments. They had settled into something deeper, something more reflective, each moment connecting in a way that made the pattern impossible to ignore. Ava Carter's voice was not loud in his memory, but it was clear, steady, unchanged by time or distance. And the words she had spoken carried a weight that did not fade, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple, precise, and true. The light turned green, and Daniel did not accelerate immediately. He eased forward, letting the cruiser move at its own pace. the road ahead open, unobstructed, but his focus was no longer just on where he was going. It was on how he would continue moving through moments like the ones he had faced tonight. As he drove, the city began to open up again, larger buildings appearing in the distance, their windows glowing faintly against the dark sky, and the familiar outline of the precinct came into view, its structure solid, unchanged, a place he had entered and exited countless times without thinking. But tonight it felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. He pulled into the parking lot slowly, the tires rolling over the smooth pavement as he guided the cruiser into its space, the engine quieting as he turned the key and sat there for a moment longer, not rushing to step out, not eager to move on, just allowing the stillness to settle fully. Inside the building, the lights were bright, the routine continuing as always, officers moving through their tasks, reports being filed, conversations low and steady, everything operating within a system that relied on clarity, structure, and trust. Daniel stepped out of the cruiser and closed the door gently, his eyes lifting toward the entrance as he walked forward, each step measured, not heavy, not hesitant, just aware. He entered the building, the familiar sound of voices and movement surrounding him. But instead of blending into it automatically, he noticed it. The way people spoke, the way they listened, the small details that made up the larger picture of what this place represented. He moved toward his desk, setting down his radio, his hands pausing briefly as he looked at it, the device that had guided his actions all night. And for a second, he did not reach for it. He simply stood there, considering everything it connected him to, every decision it would carry him into next. The shift was almost over, the night nearly complete, but the impact of what had happened was not something that would end with the clock. It would carry forward into the next day, the next call, the next person he encountered. Daniel sat down slowly, the chair creaking softly beneath him, and for a moment, he allowed himself to do something he had not done before in this space. He paused, not to rest, not to escape, but to acknowledge that the way he saw his role had changed, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but in a way that would shape every choice moving forward. And as the quiet rhythm of the precinct continued around him, Daniel understood that the most important shift had not happened out on the street under flashing lights. It had happened in the moments after, in the silence, in the space where he chose to see more than he had before, and that choice would define everything that came next. The room around Daniel Brooks continued moving in quiet routine, officers typing reports, phones ringing softly, conversations blending into the steady rhythm of a system that never truly stopped. Yet for him, everything felt slower, more deliberate, as if each second carried more meaning than it had before. He sat at his desk, the glow of the overhead lights reflecting off the surface in front of him, his report still unfinished, the cursor blinking on the screen like a quiet reminder that what happened tonight could not simply be filed away as another routine entry. He looked down at his hands for a moment, resting still against the desk, the same hands that had acted without hesitation earlier, the same hands that had followed instinct before understanding. And now they remained still, not uncertain, but aware in a way they had never been before. The words he needed to write were simple, factual, structured, but the truth behind them carried something more, something that did not fit neatly into the lines of a report, something that could not be reduced to a sequence of events. Across the room, another officer laughed lightly at something, the sound brief, normal, untouched by what had unfolded outside, and Daniel realized that from the outside, nothing had changed. The system would continue, the shifts would rotate, the calls would come in, and most people would move forward exactly as they always had. But for him, the shift was not external, it was internal, and that made it harder to ignore. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes lifting toward the far wall, not focusing on anything specific, just letting his thoughts settle into clarity, not scattered, not rushed, but steady. Ava Carter's presence returned to his mind once more, not as a moment of confrontation, but as a moment of truth, the calm in her voice, the control in her silence, the way she never needed to raise anything except awareness, and how that alone had been enough to change the entire outcome. He understood now that power was not always loud, not always visible, and more importantly, it was not always what it appeared to be at first glance. He turned back to the screen in front of him, his fingers finally moving, not quickly, not mechanically, but with intention, each word placed carefully. Not just to document what happened, but to acknowledge it fully, to recognize the part he played without avoiding it, without minimizing it. The report began to take shape, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a record of a moment that had forced him to see something he had not seen before. The room remained the same, the sounds unchanged, but within that normalcy, Daniel felt something settle into place. Not a resolution, not an end, but a beginning of something quieter, something more lasting. He finished typing and paused, reading over the words once more, not to correct them, but to understand them. And when he finally saved the report, the action felt different, not like closing a case, but like marking a point in time that would carry forward into everything that followed. He stood up slowly, pushing the chair back with a soft sound, his eyes moving across the room one last time before heading toward the exit. The shift officially over, the night behind him, but the impact of it still present, still shaping the way he moved, the way he thought, the way he would act in the moments ahead. As he stepped outside, the early morning air greeted him, cooler now, quieter, the city beginning to transition from night to day, and for a brief moment, he stood there, taking it in, not as an officer, not as someone in control, but simply as a person who had seen something clearly for the first time. And as he walked toward his car, the words settled in his mind with a clarity that did not fade, simple, steady, and impossible to ignore, that sometimes the law is not what you carry, it is what you are willing to recognize when the truth stands right in front of you.